Before the towers fell, and long before the world learned the name Al-Qaeda, another story was taking shape in the shadows of the Cold War. The path to that morning runs through decades of strategic memos and secret rooms, where men weighed pressure, leverage, and containment of a distant enemy. Decisions made to shape a faraway battlefield ultimately provided the tools for a tragedy that would eventually cross an ocean. In December 1979, Soviet troops seized Kabul. Washington responded with Operation Cyclone, arming the resistance through neighboring Pakistan. Over the next decade, this pipeline became one of the CIA's largest operations, funneling billions in cash and advanced weaponry. This resistance was a network of independent commanders and tribal factions. Some fought for faith, others for revenge, but all were sustained by a supply chain that prioritized tactical effectiveness over long-term stability. Intelligence reports from this era focused almost exclusively on Soviet attrition, counting downed aircraft and rising costs for Moscow, while the fractured political future of Afghanistan remained a peripheral concern. By empowering the most relentless fighters to achieve a short-term victory, the program constructed a lethal infrastructure that the United States could not control once the money stopped. This focus on immediate covert gains blinded leadership to the militant ecosystem taking root in the valleys where the weapons were delivered. In 1989, the Soviet military withdrew. Washington treated the retreat as a finalized victory, cutting off funding and pivoting attention to the collapsing Berlin Wall. Afghanistan was left with shattered institutions and millions of refugees. Without reconstruction plans or central authority, the country collapsed into immediate warlord chaos. For 5 years, civilians faced a landscape of robbery and violence. Exhausted by anarchy, the population looked for any force capable of imposing order. The Taliban seized Kabul in 1996. Their rule was severe, but they offered a blunt kind of security to a nation shredded by civil war. A state broken and then abandoned does not remain empty. It transforms into a sanctuary for the most ruthless power willing to occupy the ruins. Extremist networks directly inherited the anti-Soviet war infrastructure. Old smuggling routes and remote training camps provided the exact framework needed for global recruitment. Osama bin Laden used this landscape to turn the myth of defeating a superpower into a recruitment tool, leveraging the safe passages established years earlier. The resulting partnership was lethal. The Taliban provided the geographic protection, while bin Laden's network provided the ideology of transnational terror. When localized violence is granted a geographic sanctuary, it matures into an organized threat capable of reaching far beyond its own borders. The warnings escalated throughout the 1990s. Al-Qaeda's attacks were documented in real time as the network refined its methods against American targets. In 1998, coordinated truck bombs destroyed the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, signaling that the network was no longer a localized problem. 2 years later, a suicide boat struck the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 sailors and proving that the network could strike sophisticated military assets. Intelligence agencies tracked the names, funding, and travel routes, but the political urgency required to dismantle the Afghan sanctuary never materialized at the highest levels. Warnings that do not lead to action become rehearsals. By the end of the millennium, the network had practiced its logistics for a decade. The morning of September 11 began with routine travel and office work. Then, the invisible threat from the mountains became a highly visible catastrophe in the sky. The hijackers used commercial aircraft to strike civilian centers, aiming to shatter the sense of safety that a giant nation felt in its own cities. Most of the attackers were Saudi nationals, but the plot was directed from the Afghan sanctuary where Al-Qaeda leadership had found the space to plan and train for years. In less than 2 hours, the focus of the world's most powerful military shifted toward the hunting of a ghost network, sparking an immediate reordering of surveillance laws and global travel. Within days, Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force, the AUMF. It was a rapid legislative response to an unprecedented domestic wound. The document's broad language granted the executive branch the authority to pursue anyone who harbored the attackers, creating the legal basis for operations far removed from the original battlefield. Representative Barbara Lee cast the lone dissenting vote, warning that an open-ended authorization would allow for military action without a clear exit or defined limit. President Bush issued a final ultimatum to the Taliban: When they refused to surrender bin Laden without negotiations, the United States prepared for full-scale invasion. America was now returning to destroy a regime that had risen to power in the wake of earlier American neglect. A 42-nation coalition joined the invasion, driven by a mix of alliance obligations and the shared fear that a broken state could export violence anywhere. What followed was a 20-year descent into counterinsurgency and state-building. The conflict consumed thousands of lives and billions of dollars as the mission shifted through multiple generations of leadership. The trajectory of the war suggests that geopolitical consequences cannot be outsourced. Walking away from a shattered nation ensures that the resulting instability eventually follows. This 20-year conflict grew out of the quiet choices made in the 1980s, the dangerous belief that a fuse lit in the shadows would never burn all the way back to the hand that struck the spark. There are wars that begin with thunder, and wars that begin with applause. In 2001, the campaign in Afghanistan opened with both. The operational plan was remarkably elegant on paper. Small, elite intelligence and special forces teams moved on the ground. They directed a massive wave of air power from above, coordinating directly with local Afghan Northern Alliance fighters. The combination overwhelmed the Taliban forces with terrifying efficiency. Within 79 days, the government collapsed, and the capital city of Kabul fell to the coalition. In Washington, planners looked at the timeline and saw a flawless model. They concluded the United States could defeat enemies using minimal ground troops and high-tech precision strikes, without paying the massive costs of historical conflicts. The camera showed falling statues and cheering crowds. Planners measured the success of the campaign by how quickly the central regime toppled, assuming the capture of a capital equated to the submission of the entire country beneath it. But a political vacuum immediately opened underneath those street celebrations. Local militias began maneuvering for control, exploiting an environment where the coalition had very little actual authority outside of a few major cities. The Taliban had been driven from the center of power, but they had not been erased from the map. They simply withdrew from the urban centers and retreated into the brutal, isolated mountain ranges. Out in the districts and provinces, the new order was highly fragile. Without a strong central presence, deeply entrenched warlords quietly waited for their turn to assert dominance over the ungoverned spaces. The rapid invasion had forced an opening, but the conflict had not ended. The campaign had merely pried open a door, and no one fully understood the chaotic, unstable reality waiting in the rooms behind it. By December 2001, the coalition cornered Osama bin Laden in the steep cave networks of Tora Bora near the Pakistani border. Instead of sealing the exits with a massive deployment of American ground troops, planners made a fateful choice. They leaned heavily on local Afghan allies and warlords to close the net. The operation lacked the overwhelming, dedicated American ground force required to completely secure the hidden mountain routes. Bin Laden slipped away into Pakistan. For the insurgency, the empty caves delivered a clear psychological lesson. American military power was enormous, but its reach could be incomplete. Looking at the map in 2003, the invasion of Iraq radically shifted the logic of American power. Almost immediately, the new war acted as a giant siphon, pulling troops, intelligence assets, political energy, and funding out of Central Asia. Units were reassigned, and reconstruction priorities blurred right as the Afghan state entered its most vulnerable phase. The border remained porous and the countryside insecure, yet Washington had already moved its focus to a completely different stage. The campaign in Afghanistan did not fail in one dramatic moment. It slowly deteriorated through dozens of small decisions, losing its momentum to structural neglect precisely when the mission required the most focus. To maintain cheap, short-term order across a fractured landscape, the coalition paid the same warlords who had spent years fighting civil wars. In exchange for the illusion of stability, this American money directly funded old blood feuds and local extortion rackets. Planners attempted to design a new, centralized democracy. But they imported rigid frameworks into a decentralized, deeply tribal society that had learned through decades of bloodshed to view distant authority with deep suspicion. While the coalition drafted constitutions in Kabul, Taliban leaders regrouped across the border in Pakistan. Protected by these sanctuaries, they stopped fighting as a conventional army defending a capital and rebuilt their command structures into a patient insurgency. By 2004, a cheap, simple weapon redefined the battlefield: the improvised explosive device. Hidden in the dirt, these crude bombs challenge some of the most advanced military technology on Earth. A device costing a tiny fraction of a modern armored vehicle could completely destroy it. The extreme cost imbalance turned every convoy movement into an act of suspicion and made every road a negotiation with fear. Beneath the violence, a black market opium economy provided a second, highly toxic engine for the conflict. The Taliban taxed the vast poppy fields, using the profits to finance their insurgency, while simultaneously corrupting the very Afghan officials tasked with eradicating the drug trade. Rural farmers chose opium over wheat simply to feed their children. The insurgency didn't need to defeat coalition aircraft. They only needed to maintain their financing, weaponize the local economy, and wait. Eventually, the coalition realized no foreign army could stay forever. The foundational exit strategy relied entirely on training a massive new force of local Afghan soldiers and police to stand on their own. But as the local security forces grew, a devastating pattern emerged. Afghan soldiers and police, men trained, armed, and paid by the United States, began turning their weapons on coalition troops in a wave of insider attacks. These attacks inflicted profound psychological damage on the nation. Routine training sites became dangerous. Joint patrols grew incredibly tense, and the basic operational friendship required to build an army turned into a fatal risk. Suspicion changed the atmosphere of every interaction. Coalition forces learned the hard way that local loyalties were deeply layered, highly transactional, and nearly impossible for outsiders to read. A modern military can absorb heavy casualties, but it struggles to survive the suspicion that its own partners might kill them. Once that basic trust collapsed, the entire foundation of the handover strategy began to fracture. Through it all, official reports from Kabul measured progress using abstract charts, training quotas, and construction metrics. But civilians measured their reality through fuel prices, corrupt police checkpoints, and the daily fear of violence. Washington judged the long emergency as a problem of follow-through, trapped in the mythology of their rapid 2001 success. They believed better management and more money could fix the effort, failing to recognize that the original design itself was critically flawed. Opting for quick alliances with warlords, tolerating enemy sanctuaries in Pakistan, and neglecting the countryside, the coalition secured an early win. Yet those exact shortcuts created the perfect conditions for an exhausting, endless occupation. A regime fell and a sanctuary was disrupted, but believing that the fall of a capital was the end of the conflict proved fatal. If the deepest causes remain untouched, the initial triumph is merely an illusion, a trap built from overconfidence that guarantees a much longer war. In August 2021, the Afghan state dissolved. The army melted away, officials vanished, and thousands of people who believed the promises made to them were crushed against the airport gates, desperate for a way out. For 2 decades, America poured money into a country it claimed it could rebuild. It bought fleets of bombers, funded ministries, paved roads, and supplied armies. This chart compares the inflation-adjusted cost of the Marshall Plan, the American effort that rebuilt Europe after World War II, with the total direct spending and long-term obligations of the Afghan War. The $2.3 trillion spent in Afghanistan dwarfs the entire European recovery. Europe received an engine for recovery. Afghanistan received a pipeline of cash, without the institutions needed to guide it. Which leaves the question of how an operation with limitless funding collapsed virtually overnight. The money did not build a stable nation. Instead, it constructed a self-sustaining machine for waste, corruption, and systemic failure. To see where the money went, we start at the front lines. The United States spent tens of billions of dollars to build and train the Afghan National Security Forces. But the army on paper rarely matched the army in the field. Investigators consistently found ghost soldiers padding the payrolls, names of men who had died, deserted, or never actually existed. Local commanders falsified the headcounts to impress their superiors and ensure the river of American funding kept flowing into their units. For the soldiers who were actually holding the line, the result was a hollowed-out force. They were left undertrained, underpaid, and isolated against a mounting insurgency. When unit strength is mostly ink on a ledger, morale breaks. The fraud actively destroyed the Afghan military's capacity to defend the country. The failures in civilian reconstruction were documented in real time. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, produced a steady stream of reports detailing poor planning and impossible assumptions. This network diagram tracks how money vanished through layers of subcontractors. Programs satisfied bureaucratic dashboards rather than reality. Structures were treated as automatic successes. Clinics built with no medicine. Schools opened with no teachers. They were empty shells. Infrastructure became a tool for laundering optimism. A newly paved road could be celebrated with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, even if the surrounding territory was unsecured. The entire system rewarded motion over results. Decisions were driven by the need to move cash quickly, making accountability entirely optional. At the center of the state's economy, the rot reached the top. Kabul Bank, the country's largest private financial institution, imploded in a fraud scandal. Hundreds of millions of dollars were siphoned out by well-connected insiders through risky loans and fake borrowers. Public money was completely entangled with personal power. While the elite drained the banks, the rural economy ran on opium. Desperate farmers and local officials both relied on the illegal poppy harvest as the only reliable way to earn a living. The United States found itself trapped in a paradox. It was funding a government tasked with fighting narcotics, while large parts of that very state were profiting from the trade. The rapid fall of the Taliban in 2001 created a false sense of finality. The insurgency hadn't been destroyed, only displaced into sanctuaries where they could regroup and wait out the Americans. The insurgency adapted by shifting to cheap, hidden explosives. A buried pressure plate could destroy a convoy, turning every routine patrol into a psychological gamble. Then, Afghan trainees began turning their weapons on their coalition partners. These insider attacks shattered the basic trust required to run a counterinsurgency campaign. The Taliban recognized they didn't have to win open battles. They simply had to survive until the coalition's endurance ran out and internal trust collapsed. Planners in Washington tried to map a strong, centralized state onto a country where power had always flowed through local patronage, regional loyalty, and tribal networks. In this mismatched system, corruption became the daily operating reality. Citizens were forced to pay bribes at checkpoints, in courts, and at hospitals just to navigate their own country. The cost of these failures was paid in lives. Over 2,000 American service members and civilians were killed, with tens of thousands more carrying the physical and psychological scars of the conflict. The Afghan population endured staggering losses. Civilians were killed in crossfire and airstrikes, and millions were forced from their homes, driving a massive internal displacement crisis. The post-2001 years did bring genuine progress. Women entered civil society, and girls returned to school. But because those gains were tethered to fragile institutions, they vanished the moment the state fell. When a government teaches its own people that survival requires a payoff at every step, it loses its legitimacy. Exhausted by extortion, many citizens eventually submitted to the brutal but predictable order of the Taliban. The visual record of August 2021 captured the distance between a $2.3 trillion promise and the reality on the ground. The funding charts and press releases remained, but the confidence was gone. The most expensive mistake of the war was an illusion, the belief that endless money could bypass the hard work of cultural understanding. All the concrete in the world cannot hold a state together if the relationships beneath it are broken. A war can be fully funded for 20 years and still be built on sand. The story of Afghanistan did not end with a treaty or a parade. It ended in darkness, with the roar of engines on a single runway and a final aircraft lifting into the night while a country behind it fell into silence. A 2-decade campaign, backed by roughly $2.3 trillion in American investment, had dissolved in a matter of days. The trillion-dollar project evaporated the moment the foreign scaffolding was removed. This panicked final flight ended a war that had lost its shape and its purpose. For 20 years, Washington tried to solve a conflict it did not fully understand, until the mission finally arrived at this dark, chaotic runway. In 2009, the United States executed its largest single gamble of the war. 30,000 additional troops deployed into the mountains of Afghanistan to seize momentum, increase security, and mount pressure on the Taliban. But the strategy carried a specific complication. Even as the administration added forces, it announced a timeline for their withdrawal, intended to reassure a weary public at home. This timeline chart plots troop numbers peaking and then tapering off. The Taliban interpreted the announcement as a countdown clock. They realized they didn't need to win a decisive battle, as long as they could wait for the foreign political will to expire. The surge bought temporary tactical pressure, but it could not buy victory. The problem in Afghanistan remained political and structural, factors that were not resolved by adding more boots to the ground. On May 2, 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden. The architect of the September 11th attacks was found inside a fortified compound in a neighboring Pakistani town, far from the Afghan mountains. With the original target gone, the conflict survived its primary purpose. Bureaucracies kept moving and generals kept planning, mutating the campaign into a sprawling nation-building project. Without a definable finish line, the war was exposed as a cycle of strategic drift. It had become a corruption trap and a diplomatic obligation that no one knew how to end. By 2019, internal government records published as the Afghanistan Papers exposed a deep divide. Leaders privately understood the war was failing, even while they publicly insisted the opposite. Maintaining this facade for nearly 2 decades turned the war into an exercise in self-deception. Data was massaged and failures were packaged for public consumption, while the actual foundation of the mission fractured. The truth eventually became too heavy to carry. In early 2020, the United States signed the Doha Agreement, committing to a hard exit date and releasing thousands of Taliban fighters, without the Afghan government at the table. Rather than fostering peace, the deal handed the insurgency momentum. It signaled to the Taliban that the Americans were ready to leave, giving them the legitimacy they had sought for years. The agreement did not resolve the war. It merely formalized a phase of waiting, setting the stage for the collapse of the government the United States had spent 20 years propping up. In 2021, the Biden administration chose to execute the departure, setting a final withdrawal deadline of August 31st. This map displays scattered black zones representing rural Taliban control in early August. The Taliban did not need to win every battle to succeed. They only needed the Afghan state to fold as the foreign pressure vanished. What followed was an administrative collapse. Local commanders negotiated surrenders, uniforms vanished, and military bases were abandoned. Provincial capitals disappeared one after another, like lights going out in a power failure. The Taliban reached the capital in days. President Ashraf Ghani fled on August 15th, and with his departure, the system simply gave way without a decisive battle. The state dissolved because it was built on foreign props. When the money, logistics, and air cover disappeared, the institutions proved to be hollow shells. The streets of Kabul filled with fear. Families rushed to hide documents, and citizens realized the rights they had gained over 2 decades were vanishing in hours. Tens of thousands of people rushed toward the airport tarmac. What was planned as a controlled military withdrawal turned into a human stampede. At the perimeter wire, the situation was chaotic. Foreign troops made life-or-death decisions for a fleeing population, operating under the constant threat of collapse. This chaos reached a violent peak on August 26th. A suicide bombing struck outside Abbey Gate, killing 13 U.S. service members and more than 170 Afghan civilians. The attack at Abbey Gate resulted in the final American combat deaths of the war. It was a final, bitter reminder that even the exit from this 20-year project would be paid in blood. In the aftermath, the insurgency inherited billions of dollars in modern American military hardware. They took territory, and they took the evidence of the state that had failed to defend it. The massive security investments made by the United States ultimately became trophies for the enemy. The country had become a museum of abandonment. On August 30, 2021, the final C-17 aircraft departed. It left behind a generation of displaced people, a collection of graves, and memories of a mission that survived its purpose. Overwhelming military power and endless spending can build the appearance of a state, but they cannot buy a social order that people believe in enough to defend. The war was ended by altitude and engines, as the last plane disappeared into the night. But while the foreign forces vanished, the human consequences remained permanently grounded in reality.